One of the unfortunate consequences of this current pandemic is the suspension and cancellation of so many events related to Yom HaShoah v'Hagvura, which is observed this week. This year there will be no March of the Living, and so many public and government commemorations of the day will be scaled down, moved to online settings, or canceled altogether. If public commemorations are limited, I think we have an extra responsibility to reflect, at least privately, on the Shoah and on its lessons for today. I don't know about you, but I can say that in recent weeks I've been thinking a lot about the Shoah. While nothing we're experiencing can even be remotely compared to the Holocaust, there have been some images and experiences that seem to take us back to those terrible years. I saw a picture just the other day from New York of a mass grave being dug and bodies placed there, one on top of the other. And I don't know how any Jew could see that image and not be haunted by memories from the past. This time, the enemy may be invisible, but the enemy is very much present and causing a lot of death and destruction, and in response, many of our freedoms and liberties have been curtailed in ways we have never experienced before. And then there is another lesson from the Shoah, a more troubling lesson that I've been thinking about. It's the lesson of how good, decent people, often who call themselves religious, can act not so good and not so decently in difficult situations. This is obviously one of the troubling aspects of the legacy left to us by the Shoah, how so many religious people stood by as hundreds of thousands were dehumanized and deported and executed and mass murdered. In some cases, not just standing by, but many of these good, decent people collaborating in the project with their own hands. While there are always exceptions to the rule, there is no question that religion, the church, which in that time was arguably the most powerful institution in Europe, religion and its infrastructure failed miserably to stand in the way of Hitler's crimes and ambitions. This was noticed early on, by the way. In 1933, a nun and Catholic educator named Edith Stein wrote an urgent letter to the Pope. Everything that happened in Germany and continues to happen on a daily basis, she wrote, originates with a government that calls itself Christian. For weeks, not only Jews, but also thousands of fearful Catholics in Germany, and I believe all over the world, have been waiting and hoping for the Church to raise its voice to put a stop to this abuse. Is not this idolization of race and governmental power, which is being pounded into the public consciousness by the radio, open heresy? Is not all this diametrically opposed to the conduct of our Lord, who even on the cross still prayed for his persecutors? So wrote Edith Stein in 1933, and she received no response from Pope Pius XI, nor from his successor, Pope Pius XII. Edith Stein was eventually murdered at Auschwitz in 1942. Only decades later, in 1998, did the Church realize its mistake, and they canonized her as a saint, almost an admission of guilt in some ways by the Church. The Pope failed to respond to her letter, and so did millions and millions of adherents who claimed to follow a faith of love, of mercy, of compassion. Professor Miroslav Volf, a theology professor at Yale, attempted to understand how the Church failed so miserably in its duty during the war. Wolf was an interesting guy himself. He was raised amidst ethnic and religious conflict in communist Yugoslavia in the 1990s. He saw mass prejudice and violence perpetrated by fellow Christians in ways reminiscent of the Holocaust. And he has spent much of his life and career trying to understand how religion, Christianity in particular, could promote mass prejudice and violence. So he coined an interesting idea in 2011 in his book, A Public Faith. The idea was called thin religion. Thin religion, according to Wolf, tends to be formulaic, vague, and superficial. And its most defining characteristic is that it is easily influenced by factors outside of the faith itself, political factors, economic factors, nationalist factors. Wolf concludes that thin but zealous practice of the Christian faith easily fosters violence, and that most Christians practiced just that in the years of the Shoah. Thin religion veils itself in piety, but is almost always revealed in times of trial and challenge. It's in times of trial and challenge where you see what really motivates people's faith. And recently, I think we have seen a lot of thin religion. Thin religion explains why so many states, who knew very well that it was not safe for people to gather, passed exemptions to their social distancing rules for religious organizations. Thin religion is why ministers in other states defied and are still defying state laws by attempting to gather people together for Mass and services. And we have to look at ourselves too. Thin religion is why so many yeshivas and synagogues here and in Israel were operating like normal even when they knew the risks. These reckless actions and the leaders who are responsible for them were motivated by factors outside of the religion. It's people trying to protect their institutions, leaders using their power and influence to manipulate the elevation of uncompromising dogma and extremist ideology and theology. It's all thin religion. And when times get tough, it reveals itself for what it truly is. For Wolf, the antidote is the appropriately coined thick religion. Thick religion is not influenced by outside interests. It is rooted and connected to a sacred text much more than it is connected to a person or an institution. A text in particular that says that every person is created in God's image, that every life has value, that almost nothing supersedes the sanctity of human life, and that you ought to love your neighbor no matter what his or her background may be. And when you read and hear about what motivated people to save Jews during the Holocaust, you will learn about thick religion. And when you talk to church and synagogue leaders who shut down their houses of worship early and canceled weddings and limited attendance at funerals, you will learn about thick religion. And when you speak to educators who close their schools out of concern for the well-being of their students and their teachers, you will learn about thick religion. All these decisions were made to the detriment of themselves, their communities, their institutions, but none of that mattered because life comes first. That's what the text teaches. There is nothing more important. And this point actually is emphasized in our Parsha this week. In Parshat Shmini, Aaron's sons are killed because they distorted their role and their responsibilities in the sanctuary. Out of hubris and negligence, they made poor decisions. This is contrasted with Aaron's behavior at the beginning of the Parsha. In verse 16, Moses calls Aaron to come close to the altar, and Rashi is very bothered by that verse. Why does Moses need to instruct Aaron, the high priest, how to do his job? He knows to come close to the altar. He knows what to do. The answer, Rashi suggests, is that Aaron never felt fully confident, fully capable in his responsibilities. He was humble and concerned always that he might do something wrong. That's why he needed Moses' encouragement. That's why he needed his brother to come forward, to give him that extra oomph, to say, you can do it. God chose you for a reason. This is our model for a leader who is serving the Most High properly and responsibly. When religion is motivated by politics and sociology, when it's motivated by self-preservation, when it becomes about protecting leaders and institutions, bad things happen. That's called thin religion. And though it appears to be zealous and fervent and devout, in reality it is weak and thin. We need today the religion that motivated Edith Stein. We need it today, we need it always. The religion that motivated the Chasidei Umot HaOlam, the righteous among the nations, that motivated so many leaders of all faiths to act with Aaron's humility in the face of this crisis, reminding people that it is our job to love more, to reach out more, to give more, just as the Torah instructs us to do. And most importantly, never to forget that God's sanctity lives in the soul of every person. It is sacred. And therefore, no matter the cost, we choose a faith that is thick and robust, that chooses peace over war, that chooses health over illness, that chooses life above death. Shabbat Shalom.